today we're covering planning for better transport where you live. So communities having input or communities being involved in the changes to transport in their area. We'll have a quick introduction and then we'll start with our first speaker, which is Julia Grigoli. And Julie is working in the active travel team in Dlr Connector, but she's a lot of experience also in the Women on Wheels project. And that is a good consideration for a lot of people who are looking at transport. Look at the different groups in your community and how they might use the transport system that there is. And then, of course, with various different cycling campaigns. Then we'll have Conor Geraghty, who is a senior engineer in the same team as Julia in the active travel team in Dunleary. And I would recommend anyone, if you're interested on a day out and to see how this stuff is being really pushed and it's been successful in a lot of ways, Dunleary is a great place to see that. So it's great to learn from Dunleary because this is new to a lot of us. And we want to take those lessons from Dunleary, and we're glad to have Conor with us. And then we'll have finally our third speaker is Katrina Kaur from Kilkenny County Council, and that's in our own region here in the southeast. And Katrina will be talking about the challenges and the different things that can be done in regional town and the plans in Kilkenny. So I might just run through our housekeeping. So because we're in a meeting format, which is great, because at the end we get to have a decent conversation, it does mean that we'll ask everyone to mute their microphones and try to avoid distractions as we have the speakers talking, and we will leave all of the conversation and the questions and different things to the end. And feel free to use the chat feature in the Zoom, and we can answer those questions at the end. And we'll record this and we put it up on our YouTube channel. So if there's anyone who joins us a little bit late, actually, Michael, if you wouldn't mind, maybe 20 minutes in, maybe putting a little mention of that in the chat if anyone is late in, that they won't miss the start of it, because it'll be recorded and it'll be on YouTube. So now really is the time to become involved in transport in your area. And I think for many of us, it's not really something that we felt that maybe we have a chance to input into. And when I talk about transport, I talk about moving people efficiently in your area. So many, many different ways that we travel, be it, cars, buses, bikes, scooters, all of these different ways. Walking, one thing that we all forget about. And of course, the vast majority of us are walkers, pedestrians as well. So why is now the time that we look at these things? So there is greater funding and a greater priority for sustainable travel. In the last few years, we have resources, which is lovely to see our speakers today, in the councils, which are focused on not just roads and travel, but again, that question of how can we move people as efficiently as possible in our areas. And then, of course, as we're all aware, we have in the background of all this, we have the increased cost of fuel and health issues and different things like that as well, that we're trying to move some people who would like to be able to travel actively. So it's always good to remind ourselves, sometimes it can feel that when it comes to different things to influence in our towns and our villages, that it kind of seems a little bit impossible. And I always think of the example of the Netherlands, because we think of the Netherlands now as being this active travel heaven, and it really wasn't. And it was actually the same streets here, shown many years apart, but it was actually through engagement and people themselves becoming active in their own area, asking for what they wanted, that was what the change that came about here. And I can't imagine it was easy, but that photograph there shows it is possible. So we will have our first poll, just to give ourselves a little bit of a sense of where people are in the audience here. So Michael, if you wouldn't mind launching that poll. So that's just to see, have you contributed to transport planning where you live? Have you been involved in maybe asking for different things, or lobbying for maybe cycle parking or better options for public transport or whatever it is? Or have you even been involved? I know there's a good few people who will be on the call today who were possibly in the PPN network, so you might have come across different consultations and you might have fit into those. So it's just to see where people are at. So we've about half of the people have responded. So if people can quickly just give their response there. And actually, and after I do this, I'm always thinking that to share or whether I'm sharing properly. So I'll just finish up there because I think most people have responded. So interestingly, sugar, it doesn't seem to let me share. So it is actually that the vast majority, good number of people, about half of the people here have been involved in some sort of transport planning and influencing kind of transport in their area. So that's going to be really interesting to have those discussions, because we have our speakers that'll share their experience, but also when we come to the questions and answers session, if you've had something that you've learned, feel free to share it. So we will have our first speaker up then, which is Julia Grigoli, and she's an executive engineer from Dlr Down Council, and she's also been involved in the Women on Wheels project. So Julia, if you're happy to unmute yourself there and share your slides, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Grania, for the introduction. Just going to share my screen now. Can you see my slides okay?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So, good morning, everyone, and thanks again for the invitation. I'm an engineer with the active trial team in Dlr Down County Council, and what I would like to talk about today is Women on Wheels, a Dublin-based research into gender and cycling that was developed with the Dublin Cycling Campaign. So this project began in 2018 when the conversation around gender and cycling was revived in the Dublin Cycling Campaign after a public meeting was held on International Women's Day. And I got involved in this project as a volunteer and as a member of the policy group of the campaign. So basically, I didn't do this as a part of my daily job as a transport consultant and engineer, but yeah, just as a volunteer of the campaign. And yeah, we applied for funding, and the initial scope of our research was try to understand the barriers and why there is a gender gap in cycling. So why there is less women cycling than men in Ireland and in Dublin. So yeah, the research methodology was quite extensive and included a thorough literature research and an initial scoping workshop. But then the meaty part of the research that I would like to focus on today was the engagement we did in 2019 for 2 weeks with 20 women from the most diverse background, so different ages, working status, ethnicity, number of kids, and different years of experience in cycling. And we engaged them by using a cloud-connected bicycle bell that was installed on their bicycles, and to which they could record both positive and negative feelings or incidents while they were cycling. So basically, it could have been anything. Just maybe they saw a friend and who waved at them while they were cycling, and that was a positive, or it could have been even as little as a bump in the surface as a negative, or as severe as a near miss. So they could literally ring the bell anytime they felt something significant was happening. And then the location of when they rang the bell was georeferenced on an online platform. And they could then add detail to what happened on their ride. But because we wanted them to really reflect on their experience of being women cycling in Dublin, we also added a daily diary tool. So every evening they were asked about their cycle. Why did they cycle on that day? Did they cycle or not? And how did it feel? So they could expand more on their experience. And then finally, to give them an extra opportunity to give us feedback on this 2 weeks engagement, we held one-on-one interviews with each of them participants, and we recorded those interviews so that we could analyze the transcripts of these interviews, and we analyzed in depth the transcripts and try to identify common patterns in what women told us by using a social science coding technique called thematic analysis. So I'll move on now to the coded team. So some of the emerged topic that women discussed with us through the voices of what women told us.
It's one of my favorite things about cycling, this interaction that you don't get when you're in a car.
So of course, feeling of community. Some participants reported how cycling made them feel more connected to people than using other modes of transports. Then autonomous mobility, and this relates to the sense of freedom, but also independence that it's afforded to women by cycling.
I think it's the scale of the bicycle, the fact that you can go down those little side roads and eventually go down the little tiny path. It gets you to places that you wouldn't.
Then another positive was, again, related to the flexibility of the bicycle, which allows women to multitask more. I mean, at least for some of our research participants.
I love the flexibility of it as well. You can decide, do you know what, I'll go down there, pick up whatever.
And then safety work.
I know on a night out, I feel much happier when I know that I'm cycling home, rather than having to rely on someone for a lift or getting a taxi. I feel a lot safer when I know that I can get myself home at any point, which is really reassuring.
So what this quote is talking about is that, yes, personal safety is very important for women, and for some of our research participants, cycling could even enable a better sense of safety than other transports. So despite all the fact that cycling can provide all these benefits to women, the data at the moment from the latest census is that only 27% of all cyclists in Dublin and in Ireland are women. And this compares similarly, just to give you an overview of the data in other countries to them. So it's similar to the UK, but compares quite unfavorably to other countries where the cycle culture is probably more established, but also there was provision of inclusive cycling infrastructure has been given through the years. And so as Ronnie was saying, it is possible to achieve in Ireland as well. And so this is because there are barriers, of course. So I'm going to go through some of the barriers that women mentioned through the research.
I'll tend to choose a longer, slower route, a route I feel safer on, and I'll tend to avoid the lowest tracks, for example. But he doesn't care about that. He doesn't mind cycling on those. I have my routes, and then I have my routes with the children, which are different again.
And this just go to show that cycling infrastructure isn't really gender neutral. And other issues with the built environment could be with lighting.
I don't want to be down a dark alley untying my bike. There's always a bit of time hooking everything on, and I'd be conscious about that.
And then with the coherence and legibility of routes.
Around town, a lot of the back roads are suddenly no right turn, no left turn, or one way. I walk them a lot so I don't have to think about road signs, but on bike, trying to obey law, suddenly, can't go this way.
And it's not only about the cycling infrastructure, the issues that women experience, it has also to do with cycle identity and the lack of female representation. So let's see what women said about that.
People often say that you're brave, whereas for men, it's just normal. And I feel that I come up against that a lot, or people say that a lot. They're surprised to see you on the road.
And other issues could be, again, with conflicting dress codes.
So it's just the expectation of what we're supposed to wear in the professional world. It's not actually active friendly. If I walked in with looking a bit wind-tossed and my hair's wet from cycling, it seemed like I didn't prepare myself. Whereas with guys, it's, oh, he's great, he's cycling, so active.
And cycling stigma and harassment was another theme that came up, which, yeah, of course, can affect both men and women. But yeah, let's see what some of our research participants said about this.
It also annoys me that usually the bike lane is the worst part of the road. Lots of glass, bumps, holes. You feel like a secondary citizen. It amazes me that cyclists have such a bad image here. Who are we harming?
And yeah, this participant was actually from the Netherlands, and not from Dublin. And she was, yeah, of course, feeling, yeah, she felt it. There was a difference, yeah, with the perception of a cyclist in here. And yeah, so the recommendation from our research are, of course, that by listening to women, we can understand better their difference, the different preferences, needs, and perceived barriers to cycling. And for this reason, more qualitative research and not just quantitative can help understand better the different patterns of decision making behind the travel choices. And of course, a recommendation for engineers and planners is providing for inclusive cycling infrastructure, which means that we should always apply universal design principle, which doesn't have to do just with gender, but it means basically designing for all ages and abilities. And then again, about the cycling culture.
2 minutes, Julia.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, we need to normalize cycling as something women do. And this is a recommendation for everybody who is involved in campaigning, but also promotion of active travel. So maybe also using images of portraying women cycling as well. And also ensuring women's participation in the transport sector to achieve all the above. And I just added some lessons learned that could be relevant to the work of communities and of the sustainable energy communities, which are actually a lesson that I learned myself because I was coming from a different background. I mean, coming from an engineering background, and for me, yeah, what this project really taught me was the importance of working in a multidisciplinary group and investing time and create an appropriate work method so then the people you engage with really can be with you through the whole engagement process and be sure that they are listened and it's about kind of building that trust. So then they will be able to give you an incredible feedback, and it's important that the feedback is coming from the lived experience of people. So then you will have better data, and when you have this better data, this will inform a bottom-up approach to planning and design. So you can find the tailored solution that targets the real needs and issues of a group and of a community. And because this project was about the gender gap, this again showed us that we're all biased, so talking to people is better than making an assumption for them. And then just a very final few points on how, if you're interested in promoting cycling, I think identifying a cycle champion in your community, if the focus is active travel, but yeah, it could be also any topic. It's important to find the people who can champion your active travel initiatives. Bring people with you on a LED cycle, for example, and do research. Like we applied for a fund to Community Foundation, and you can do the same, find a topic of interest in the community and do some research on it. And yeah, then of course we'll do the discussion later on your suggestion. And thank you so much for your attention. Apologies, I went a little bit over time, and yeah, I just wanted to credit the whole team and yeah, Liberty Bell as well for providing the research tool. Thanks again.
Great, thank you, Julia. I know there's already comments in there. I can imagine actually this is probably maybe the strength for sustainable energy communities, particularly our groups that we have in the Southeast, that actually the communities can go out and ask those questions and can get to know people and see what the needs are around the cycle lanes or the bike parking or whatever it is. So you've given us like a really good kind of description as to how you've gone and done that with this research. So thank you very much, Julia. So next up we have Conor Garr, who's joined us from Dlr Rathdown, and he's a senior engineer on the active travel team. And Conor, you'll be talking about your experience in Dlr Rathdown, and we can't wait to hear it.
Thanks, Grania, and good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody can see my slides there. So as Grania said, I'm senior engineer for active travel in DLR. So my role will be to roll out walking and cycling infrastructure, but also public realm within the authority. When it comes to public engagement, I suppose there are only really two main actors. So they're the elected members, who are the councillors elected by the people to represent the people and set policy within a local authority. And then they're the executive, which we would fall into that category, and our responsibilities are to implement the policy set by the councillors. And I've just put a few questions in there, maybe more to provoke discussion than anything else. But if a policy has been set down by the elected members and the council go to implement that policy, is there really a question about whether it should or shouldn't happen? A lot of the time you see there's a huge battle to maintain the status quo, but if the policy is there, you know, should it happen, or should there be a question of the if? It shouldn't be about whether it should or shouldn't happen. It's more about the how. When it comes to public engagement, what is required? Well, generally speaking, there's two legislative provisions the executive rely on to implement schemes. There's Part 8, which is a statutory planning process that requires the approval of the elected members. But I would note that cycling facilities are exempted from Part 8 generally. And then there is Section 38, which is under the Roads Act, which gives the local authority executive quite far-reaching and fairly extensive powers to implement schemes. So there is actually no barrier to the executive implementing projects without any consultation. And perhaps that's something maybe that the public aren't fully aware of, that generally there isn't a requirement on the executive to consult with anybody if they're going to implement active travel schemes. Now, obviously, you would, of course, engage, and the best schemes are the ones that have extensive engagement in them, but it is important to note that there isn't that requirement, and maybe that's the first misunderstanding people have about it. The next question is, well, how should the executive engage with the public? So the traditional method is a top-down, where we would propose a project and then debate what happened about whether it's good or bad. And I suppose at a bare minimum, you would put stuff on the website and allow people to submit comments. But generally what we do is we hold webinars and we have information days and we go into the public. So that's not really, I'm not going to talk about those type of approaches because that's typically what everybody does. But I'm going to maybe touch on some of the other things that we've done that have had really positive feedback that might be useful to the people on this call. So this project, we've called it the Dlr Connector, is an east-west. This is a live project that's currently in preliminary design, but it's an east-west corridor crossing the entire county. It's about 9 kilometers long, and it's a fairly significant project. So the first stage we did was a pre-design public engagement. And often the criticism with the top-down approach is that you present a scheme and people accuse you of fait accompli and that you're not open to engagement and that you can't change things and it's too far gone. So this was a formalized approach where we went out and did a number of workshops and we asked people how do they want to see their communities developed and designed and what would they set as the priorities for schemes of this nature. And the shot on the bottom left is we went into a number of the schools along the way as well to try and find out what their priorities were. So generally the comments that come back, and it's consistently comes back in all consultation, that safety and segregation are the things that people want and they prioritize that above all else. So that has a number of, I mean, that's not a surprise to us, but it also gives us a kind of a mandate when we're having to make difficult decisions at junctions where you might be reducing car capacity to implement segregated facilities. I mean, that does give you a mandate before you get to the detailed design. Another method of delivering schemes is either through pop-up infrastructure or trialing. So in terms of legislative provision, Section 38 of the Roads Act would allow the executive to do a trial or pop-up infrastructure. And there is no special legislation required. It's more a commitment from the executive that we would undo something after a certain period of time. And the benefits to that is that it does help deal with anecdotal patterns over the status quo. And you always get the whatabouts, and you can see it consistently across projects across the country. You know, what about traffic displacement? What about the parking, business access, emergency services? These are whatabouts that are thrown out in front of projects to try and stifle them. And it can be quite difficult sometimes to deal with those comments, particularly where traditionally maybe traffic modeling might be used, but that's based on pre-COVID patterns and it's maybe not as accurate now. So trialing is a really useful way because it does help to deal with those battles, because then you can measure all of those things during the trial and it allows people to experience it, and that can be for good and also reassuring to people that maybe it's not as bad as they were expecting it to be. And then it helps the design process as well, because quite often it's using temporary materials and you can tweak it and then you know exactly what you're getting when you go to a more permanent scheme. I'd make the comment as well that it does help build support internally within an organization as well as externally, that sometimes even within local authorities there's resistance from other departments for big changes like this. So a trial or pop-up infrastructure helps to deal with those kind of concerns. So just some examples of pop-up infrastructure. The coastal mobility route is on the left there. That was one that was brought in during COVID. It's 4.5 kilometers long, 3.6 kilometers that is fully segregated. And just to pick up on what Julia said, the data that we've collected afterwards, the gender split on it is about just under 40% women, which would be far higher than the national average, and also demonstrates that if you provide safe and segregated facilities, women feel more comfortable using it. But also interestingly, there's 11% of the users are kids less than 11. So it wouldn't be unusual to see people cycling independently on it. And even that young lad in the picture there, he's obviously very comfortable because it is of a standard that encourages people to use it at all ages and abilities. So the photo on the right is another pop-up cycle facility that we did near a school, and the one in the middle is pop-up traffic management, which most people will be familiar with. But in this case, we had done it to provide extra space for people to queue and pass each other when getting to school for social distancing, but also had a function to see how tightly we could narrow the road, and while it would still function, that actually fed into the design for a school zone that we're currently working on. So it had a kind of a dual purpose that you could demonstrate to people that, well, we're going to narrow it to this amount and we already know that that works. Another scheme is Georgia Street in Dunleary, and the photo on the top is the kind of the pre-pedestrianisation trial that was done last summer. And if you can imagine trying to suggest a pedestrianisation scheme, when I see Capel Street has successfully become or is going to become re-pedestrianised, but there's a lot of whatabouts that have to be dealt with, and a trial in this case was really positive for us as well. So we're moving to make Georgia Street permanently pedestrianised on foot of the trial. But in terms of pop-up infrastructure, it's very easy to deliver a scheme like that with, you know, additional planting and tubs. You can see even from the top photograph and this one that the amount of extra planting that we were able to add to the street in a very short time was really beneficial. Just to talk a little bit about bottom-up schemes. So this is one over in the Dundrum side of our county, and there are a number of kind of heavily trafficked routes around this area of Drumartin Park and Drumartin Crescent. And the local community had a lot of concerns about rat running, and they wanted us to help. Now, traditionally, what would be proposed is a scheme designed by the council with a period of public consultation. But in this case, what we did is we provided design assistance and sort of technical expertise to the Residents Association to help them develop a design for their area. So these are just some of the shots of some live polling that was done, and this was developed during the height of COVID when we were in lockdown, and it helped bring people along to the idea of, you know, what were the concerns that they had and what is that they would like to see happen. And what it did was it helped them realize that, well, in fact, getting rid of the cars from our street is probably going to be what we want to do. Whereas if the council had proposed to say a modal filter or some other restriction, it might have a battle might have ensued about trying to get that over the line. just to say it is quite a labor-intensive process, and there's just a number of workshops that was done over a number of months, but it did result in more than 70% of all the local people buying into the scheme. So that's just a shot of one of the schemes, or one of the designs. So essentially there was 2 green spaces, and we were proposing to bring the whole lot up to the same level. So the vehicles are still have access through the space, but it's to try and generate this community space. And then there was also a modal filter, which restricts the movement of vehicles, but still allows people walk and cycle through the area. Lover Laneways is a project in Sallynoggin, so that there is a series of laneways running through the area, and at one end is the schools and the community facilities, and at the other end there are the bus and shop areas, and you can see that the series of laneways in the picture above. And these are ideal active travel routes, but there is quite a serious antisocial element along the laneways that, as the community aren't interested in using them or maybe are too afraid to use them. So what we did was we engaged a Playful City, who are a social enterprise, but they're public engagement specialists, to try and work with the community to bring them along on a project that would help rejuvenate the laneways. And actually the first thing that they did was to engage with the College of Art and Design to develop branding for the routes of this kind of doodle guy here. He's the kind of active, I'm not sure what you call him, but that's the branding that was developed for the route, and that's run through all of the different branding and documents that we have. But it also engaged the college, because now they feel they're part of the project at the start. So some of the other things that we did is that we had a pop-up post box where people could submit ideas. That's obviously a shot of a community forum that was had with the local residents. On the bottom right, we did a pop-up market at Christmas time as a way to try and sell to the people that these laneways don't just provide a walking and cycling function, that maybe they could be more, and to try and encourage people maybe to start thinking about it in a different way. So where it's at the moment is that we have a number of our own internal departments looking at things like servicing and public lighting, but residents are starting to think now about things like community notice boards and other measures that they can put in to try and have or to enhance this space for their own use.
You have your 2 minutes there, Conor. Thank you.
Thanks, Rania. So finally, this is actually probably my second last slide, just for those people who are thinking that they want to engage with the council. I suppose the majority of correspondence and interactions that we often get are quite, I won't say negative, but people have an issue that they wanted to deal with. And that's fully to be expected. I always sort of suggest it's like my broadband provider. I don't randomly ring them up and tell them my broadband's working perfectly and thank them for their time. It's only when you have an issue that you generally engage with the council. But if you're looking to influence either the elected members or the council executive, that a far more positive approach will always be more successful. So I'll give some examples on the photo on the top right. We had a project called Active School Travel, and there was an element of that where we're proposing a one-way system, which was highly contentious. It had a number of outings on Pat Kenny, and it did a stint on Joe Duffy, and it even made prime time. But this, in response to the local groups, and I think the cycle campaign assisted, they had their own event where they showed that there is support locally for people wanting to walk and cycle, and it's not. And I think the public perception of the cycle campaign is quite negative. They see them as this well-oiled machine that, stuffs ballots of public consultation, and that's not the case. So that's a really positive way to build support, so that the executive can clearly see that, but also the councillors realise that there are a lot of local people who are interested in schemes progressing. Another example of the Dlr Connector project is one that is currently in prelim design, as I mentioned, but on the bottom right there, that's an event again that DLR Cycling, just to get families out and to show them where the routes were and to try and help build support locally. So the tweet on the left from David McWilliams is quite an interesting one. This was back in September 2020, and he tweeted that if you like what you see in relation to the coastal mobility route, you should let your council know. And before I realized that this tweet had gone out, we were bombarded by hundreds of letters of support. And quite funnily, we had to have a meeting about how do we deal with all these things. We didn't know what to do with people that were very happy with what we were doing. And do you just say thank you, or do you have to reply to them? Because we had a few people that were we got 300 or 400 letters the following morning. So there was a bit of interest, but certainly that kind of love bombing of councils or councillors really makes people think that there is more than just that vocal minority. And the centre, the pie graph in the centre is a scheme we just completed recently, and one of the questions was, do you support the scheme or do you support it with changes? So between the two, we had about, I think it was about 250 submissions, which is a pretty good level of engagement. So 80% of people wanted for the scheme to proceed. So we're finding now, as we're developing projects, that communities see what other areas are getting, and that they've become very engaged themselves because they want that, or they want to connect to the nearest route or the coastal route or other routes, and that they are becoming very much engaged. So it's not only the negative voices, and it's about tapping into that support as well. That's really important, particularly for community groups if they're trying to influence policy. So that's all I have, Grania. So I'll hand it back to you. And
great, thank you, Conor. You make me think I need to go and ring my broadband provider. So thank you. But honestly, and actually, I was living in Dlr. I might have sent one of those letters at the time because I loved it. But that how to engage with the council, Conor, I really appreciate. And yeah, and I suppose Katrina, if you're happy, you could probably add to that from the point of view of Kilkenny here. So I think possibly for our groups, have we lost Katrina? Is she still there? Is she our next speaker? Katrina?
I can see her name there.
There we go. There you go.
I'm here, Grania.
Good. Little heart attack in the morning, but we're good. Katrina, if you want to share your slides. So, but just to follow up on what Conor was saying there. So, like, I think that showing the interest and also being strategic around what you want to do and doing your research would probably help. Katrina, if you're happy to go ahead there.
Perfect. Can you see my screen there, Grania?
Yeah, I can,
Yeah, lovely. So yeah, my name is
actually Katrina, do you mind putting it on full screen just so it'll be easier for people to see? Perfect.
Yeah, lovely. Sorry about that. Yes, my name is Katrina Kaur, and I'm on a research project with the Irish Research Council and Kilkenny County Council. So it's based in WIT, or as we should say, it's the Southeast Technological University. So still not quite used to saying that. But it's specifically looking at cycling in Irish towns. And, I suppose this is our smaller towns, so outside of our cities. And while originally the focus was on cycling, I think the more and more that we looked at it, everything is so integrated that it's very hard to look at cycling in isolation. So it's probably steered more towards now looking at sustainable transport in Irish towns. So I'm just going to briefly, what I'm going to talk about is some of the current trends maybe in our towns. What if we do nothing, and some of the solutions that we're exploring and the next steps. So I suppose this, just some of the basics, is the population demographics in Ireland. So from the 1960s, our population is constantly rising, and it's expected that there's another 30% increase in population in Kilkenny before 2040. So increasing urbanisation even outside of our larger cities. And I suppose a lot of the cities in the southeast are experiencing that. We have the commuter belt, which is obviously experiencing huge growth. But if you look at this graph here, we can see that it's also happening in the southeast. So we see Kilkenny here with quite a lot of growth, but also Carlow. And it's really only the towns in the, maybe the northwest and the west that aren't experiencing these growths. And of course, these figures are 2016 census, which is pre the huge drive for remote working. So it will be interesting to see that with the new census figures. So if we look at what has happened with cycling as well, with our increasing urbanisation, so we see a dramatic decline in cycling. And just looking at some of the towns around the similar size to Kilkenny, Kilkenny is actually the grey, which is quite hard to see there, but it's almost following the green line, which is Tralee. And we can see, so back in the late 90s, 14% was the cycling, was the mode share for cycling from the census. So this is for education and work journeys back in the late 90s. So that has dropped dramatically to under 3% now for most of the towns. Again, back in 2016. So, and I suppose if you were to look at car use and graph that, the graph would be going the other way completely. But we just looked a little bit more closely then at Kilkenny to see where the huge, to look at that figure and to break it down a little bit more. And the huge drop for us, a dramatic decline, was with secondary school students. So over 40% of secondary school students travelled by bike in 1996. And we have two large girls' schools in Kilkenny now, one with over 1,000 students one with over 1,000 girls, and we don't have 5 bikes in that school. So we're not even reaching 1% of the population in our girls' schools. So back to Julia's point, a huge gender gap. And it's not just in Dublin, it's in Kilkenny too. The primary schools, we have seen the power of cycle champions because we've huge differences in our primary schools. It's cycle champions, from the school management and from the school teachers and the principal, but it's also the infrastructure around the school. So one of our schools that has the best infrastructure also has a good mode share of cycling, much higher than the 3 to 4%, and can be up to 20% in the summer. But generally a huge decline and a large car dependency for school-based journeys. And that car dependency is something that we see throughout Ireland here, and we can see that there's over 60% car dependency in most of the country, with lots of pockets of over 70% car dependency. Over 30% of all the Irish population live outside of settlements, and that's not just cities or towns, that's any urban settlements. And in Kilkenny, 52% of the Kilkenny populations live outside of settlements. By settlements there, I mean over, as far as I can remember, it's over 100 households. So we're talking about a very rural population. So with that rural population comes a lack of access to public transport. Most of our residents would be over 7 kilometres from a public transport in remote areas, compared to 400 metres in the city. And then access to trains in rural and remote areas is, the average distance is 47 kilometres. So there is a huge car dependency outside of the larger cities in Ireland, and that presents its own challenges then when we're trying to shift the mode of transport. But if we do nothing, what happens? Well, worldwide, this is the figures from the World Health Organization, 4.2 million deaths to ambient air pollution, 3.2 million deaths due to lack of physical activity, and 1.2 million deaths due to traffic fatalities. And I think a lot of the time we're inclined to think of, well, this affects, again, the larger urban cities, but Ireland has one of the highest rates of respiratory illness in young people, so it is a huge problem for us in Ireland. If we look, air pollution has a huge impact on people throughout their life course. From pregnancy, it's low birth weight with children, asthma and slower development of lung function, and development problems. And then that goes on to, in the elderly, it can present as asthma, lung function decline, lung cancer, diabetes, and then heart attack, heart failure and stroke. So it has a huge impact on well-being, but it also has a huge economic cost. So then perhaps are electric cars the solution? Well, electric cars, if we swap to electric cars, it has no impact on congestion in our towns. Cars are very inefficient use of space. They can be parked up for 23 hours of the day while only being used for 1 hour of the day. Electric cars still have a large energy requirement, which increases with the size of the vehicle and also with its driving patterns as well. The other thing about the switch to e-cars is that it's inequitable, so it creates a further socio-economic gradient. At the moment, e-cars are quite expensive, but even car ownership in itself creates its own gradient. So if we rely on e-cars, we're increasing that divide. And of course, e-cars still requires costly transport infrastructure. So we need more solutions. But how do we increase active travel in our towns when our population is so car dependent? What do we do next? So I suppose land use change is one of the huge things, but it's also one of the slowest things to change. And it's the creation of our 10 and 15-minute neighbourhoods. And if they can do it in cities like Paris, then this is what we have to replicate in all our little towns and our villages. So the 10-15-minute city concept, town concept, means that we can access the services we need within 10 or 15 minutes, school, education, health, and retail, that they're within our 10 or 15-minute radius. We need to look at the short journeys. We need to try and replace the short journeys. So in our towns and villages, we're looking at the journeys that are under 15 minutes in length, and these are the ones that we might be able to change to active transport. These are the key things, I suppose, that will help reduce the car dependency. We'll also have to look at moving towards public, collective and active transport, but that we prioritise public and collective transport in our towns and we facilitate that. And it can be simple things like sharing bus stops with regional providers and the public transport system. It can be bus lanes in larger towns, but it can be places for buses to park up, and it can be space to cater for the bus drivers as well when they are putting in the essential little ancillary facilities. Park and strides on the outside of our towns, so those with those longer commutes have the option of leaving the car and then making the last mile by foot or by bike. Tying that in, of course, with public transport so that there's also the bus option there when needed. Interconnectivity is huge of the modes, but also of the different providers. So particularly for rural Ireland, that we're also looking at our private bus operators as well, and maybe our demand responsive transport systems too. I think we have one of the best examples of that in Europe, and a lot of people don't know about. Maybe it's our best kept secret with the local links. And this
2 minutes there, Katrina.
Perfect. Well, I won't speak about this because it's actually from Connor's. So I'm robbing some of your photographs, but a fantastic example of placemaking as well, which is actually making somewhere attractive, so people actually want to spend time and want to experience what a place that considers placemaking can bring. So I suppose just the consideration of the development of a cycle network, as laid out by the National Cycle Manual, it's safety, coherence, directness, attractiveness and comfort. But from our research, it's the junctions and the severance points that have to have the huge considerations. Some examples of some very attractive cycle facilities, but that what we need overall is to start by identifying our network. So what is our network in our towns? We need to think about connecting our trip generators. We need to look at where all those little short journeys are happening and prioritise those. And most importantly, we need to involve the community in this process. So this is something that we're undertaking in Kilkenny at the moment, is we're just embarking on our SUMP process, which is our Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. And we're trying to involve as many stakeholders as possible, but also provide them with the information that is needed to make informed decisions and about the urgency of change that is required. So the other thing about the SUMP process, it's used widely across Europe, is that then we should be able to come up with solutions for our own local context. And again, I think this might also be robbing from Dún Laoghaire with their cargo bikes. And here in Seattle, they have the buses that can carry the bikes. And this is our Kilkenny example. We're looking forward to reinstating one of our old pedestrian bridges. So thank you very much for your time. And as I said, this is just a quick photo from this morning. We had a little panic this morning because it was transitioners from a local secondary school were delivering in one of their nearby primary schools, and there was no bikes. So we do need very simple things in place as well. We need behaviour change programs, and we need to support people who are. We need to start at the bottom. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrina. And I have to say, and I've spoken to you about that programme about the transitioners training the primary school children, is a great success, and it actually encourages the secondary school children to get back into cycling, which is a wonderful benefit from it. So I will just quickly go through these questions. So yes, so Jeanette points out about the study And She Cycles, which is there's a really interesting video for that, and basically that was a study similar to what, Julia, what you've done, but specifically focusing on teenage girls and their as Katrina said, the lack of young women cycling and what can be done. So there's a lot of really good recommendations in that report, and the video is really good. So Liam Scott made the point there about often wonder whether individuals who are responsible for bike lanes have ever put their bum on a saddle. Thankfully, that is changing, and actually often I think it's the challenge of, kind of taking roads that were designed really for cars and for, I don't know, horse and carts back in the day, and then kind of wedging in a cycle lane, which of course is not always the best solution. And that's why it's great for Katrina, Connor and Julia to be laying out these different options for communities. So Connor, there's a question for you there. Just wondering if you met much resistance to the change in the layout. So this was the community had come to you about changing the layout. So did you get much resistance, or how did that work out?
I suppose there's always resistance. That is the challenge, I think, particularly active travel or community schemes. It's not a technical problem. And unfortunately, a lot of the departments are set up with engineers at the top. It really is a kind of a hearts and minds challenge where you're trying to convince people to build support for schemes. But it does, or you do always meet resistance. And it's about having data, like well-established data that you can show people or point to other schemes that were successfully implemented, or indeed that scheme I mentioned in Dromark Park, we put them in contact with people in other communities who had done similar things within Dún Laoghaire, and they often go to meet them and they do a number of things, like they obviously explain to them how they did it, but also they reassure them that the council are trustworthy, I suppose, is a big one for us as well, that we're not going to just drop and run if there is an issue. And I would even extend that to other local authorities come to visit, and we visit other local authorities as well to see how they're doing it. But it is really the difficult thing, is about how do you bring people along who fundamentally don't believe you're doing the right thing. And it has to be a data-led approach. There isn't any other way, really.
I think as well, an example I've come across, Conor, seeing, so I remember years ago, a cycle lane was going in, and there was a lot of worry, and people were saying, oh, well, you know, there was basically houses and then a cycle lane, and people were worried about coming out, and they were saying, well, it'll be thronged. But of course, the nature of cycle lanes is you have one person and you have a minute and there's no person, you know. So once people saw it and they were able to visit something similar, they were thinking, great, I'm not going to run over a cyclist as I leave my house in the morning. So anything like that can help to see the examples. Liam has a question there about the CCTV on the lanes project there, Conor. Was that something that was employed, or was that something you would recommend?
Well, CCTV is an interesting one, because generally local authorities don't have any CCTV, because we do have for enforcement purposes around dumping, but CCTV for antisocial behaviour is run by the Gardaí. And recently the case in Limerick, a lot of the CCTV that we've had to switch off because of the GDPR issues. So obviously getting it installed is actually the easy bit. Who monitors it and then who would take action is one that, so it isn't one that we have as an option or part of the toolkit, unfortunately.
So probably for you actually having those lanes being used and well lit, and like hopefully that is your more complicated way to avoid that antisocial behaviour.
Well, like what they're looking at is community groups and the neighbourhood watch, then designing it in a way that people can't hide, that it's well lit, that it's well surfaced. You know, you can design out some antisocial behaviour issues, but if you can get the community to engage in it and feel like that the space is for them and that they have ownership of it, that will help as well. You know, ultimately they're the users that will benefit, but that is a far more complicated and sort of long-term project than just knocking up CCTV, which is
but it is one that it strengthens the entire community if you can crack that. So it's interesting that we're talking about transport, but it's about so much more. It's about, you know, basically how we live in our communities. So Dan has an interesting question here from Carlo, basically about, you mentioned about policy, Conor. So last week in the sessions we talked about community groups becoming active as a positive voice at the planning stage of projects. Can you comment on this? And actually, Katrina, you might like to do the same in the context of bringing that positive voice from communities to even making policy in the council.
Is that related to project specific, like to a particular scheme? Or
actually, Dan, you
policy?
might chime in there, because I think it might be related to, if you want to unmute yourself, Dan.
No, it wasn't anything. Thanks, Conor, and the other speakers there for great presentations. It wasn't anything specific, Conor, really. It's just in the general policy making, we'll say at SPC level, and the voices that the PPN representatives bring to it, and how that can be. And look, I know it's an evolving thing, and the PPNs are getting stronger and stronger. But in the light of your opening remarks, maybe you'd say a little bit about that.
Yeah, like that. Like community groups can have a really strong impact, particularly on policy generally within local authorities. But also if you're members of the SPC, you do have a voice. And community groups that are well organized and have reasoned arguments will always be listened to. Well, maybe I'll just speak for Dlr at down, but generally, if somebody comes forward with a genuine concern and they have support within the community, it's very easy for us to support them. Traditionally, I suppose groups only form to object to things, and it's usually a large development or something, and they're set up in a kind of a negative context. Whereas, like the likes of the Drumartin Park scheme, that the group came together because they wanted to make the area better, and it's very hard for anybody to criticise genuine engagement. There's another group at Bike Dean's Grange set themselves up to try and promote safe cycling in their area only, and it's a very, very positive slant on every, you know, it's not something that councillors would object to, because they can't dismiss it as being sort of objectionist or NIMBYism. They're actually trying to fight for local betterment of their area. Like we've done a lot of schemes, and a lot of groups are well engaged with us, and we're finding now that people are coming forward where they want to do schemes we don't feel we're ready for, which is nearly the other end of the scale, where people want roads closed or they want public ground done, but we don't have the capacity to deal with them at this stage. So I would suggest that if you're well organised and well reasoned, people will always support you.
Katrina, do you have any thoughts on that? Like what in Kilkenny, or Julia, how would you feel about communities coming to you, and what way should they present what they'd like to do?
Yeah, well, I suppose for us, we feel again that a lot of the times, as Conor said, groups will only appear when there's something that they're against, or something that is of concern to them, and that you don't hear about the overwhelming support that might be out there. So I suppose, and it comes back to data again. So I think in the last little while we've done a couple of surveys in the community just to gauge the level of support, and you get a much more accurate reflection. So while there might be some very strong voices against certain decisions, we might know that actually there's over 80% support in the community. So this has to, I think it's about gathering that data that's out there. I think when the data is presented, if people are involved in the processes at the earlier stage, it makes it much easier to get the information out to everyone. So that's, I suppose, why we're embarking on the SUMP. We feel that people haven't, it's hard to have the structures in place to involve people earlier, and it's also very resource heavy. So by going with the SUMP, that we're hoping we'll have a structured way that people can feed into what's going to shape Kilkenny for the next number of years around transport decisions. Like we'll be reaching out to local organisations, but we're also going to have a number of public meetings, and that hopefully we will present information that's there, and we'll be looking at it in the context of the Sustainable Mobility Policy, which was only published, a month or two ago, the Climate Action Plan, that this is the information that we have to take into consideration when we're making important decisions. And I think when that's presented to people, then the right decisions are made. But it's about involving people at an early stage, but it's just so resource heavy. And that maybe the local authorities aren't resourced to do that.
But that's where, and through the SEC programme, if a community wants to work on something to do with transport, we'd be happy as the county mentors to kind of facilitate that and do the surveys and different things like that if people want to get involved in that stage. So it is quite small teams in the county council. I'd like to kind of just make people aware of that, but there is a drive towards sustainable transport. So thank you, Katrina. So there's a question here for Julia. So has any local authority that you're aware of used the UN Women's Safety Audit tool? And are you familiar with it, and do you think it's useful?
So I'm not aware that it has been used, but yeah, it's definitely like any safety audit tool. And yeah, there's a concept actually of gender mainstreaming, which I think it should be applied and taken in consideration by local authority for sure, which was applied actually in Vienna. And that's how they made Vienna kind of they say gender-proofed city. So all the placemaking and the public realm was basically gender-proof, so that it was again equally accessible by people of all gender, ages, and ability. And so yeah, there is this suppose kind of a feminist approach to planning called gender mainstreaming, and yeah, I think it would be definitely helpful for sure to start audit in this sense. But then also going back as well to the point on policies, I suppose, yeah, even if you're a group of volunteers, like even as an NGO, like you can do research and definitely take any opportunity to have your voice heard. And yeah, for example, with our research, we did a few pages report that when there was a public consultation on the sustainable mobility policy review, we actually submitted that with a few points from our research. So yeah.
That's great. And I might just finish up there, guys. Apologies for running over a little bit. I just wanted to say as well, just to remind people that we mentioned last week, if it was just, particularly for tiny towns groups or different people, that they might want to start on looking at transport in your area. One of the things you might do is maybe some of the walkability audits that we mentioned last week from Tashka, and I can share those in the link. That we'll follow up with afterwards in the recording. And I think it's probably just even to get, if you want to start getting thinking that way, and kind of keep an eye out on your local authorities. As Conor says, if there's something that you feel there will be the benefit of for you, absolutely be sure to say that. And because it's only really, it's great that the councils are developing a lot of these sustainable travel mechanisms, but it's also important that we have kind of good reception of them if people are going to benefit from them. Anyway, my language skills are gone today, but I would really like to thank all of our speakers. Fantastic examples, lots to think about there, from who to consider to how to go about it, to like even just looking at how things have changed and how they can change going forward. So I'd like to thank Julia, Conor and Katrina, and thank you all for your attention. And as I say, we will have this on the recording, and we will, so feel free to share it amongst your community groups. And thank you very much, guys, for your attention this morning. Oh, and next week we are looking at 4 wheels. So we're looking at electric vehicles, buses, home car ownership, car sharing, all those different bits and pieces. So there's lots of different things that we can consider. So thank you very much, everyone.